I'm Zama Coursen-Neff, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch.
So, in the context of our human rights and humanitarian action module, we'll be talking a little bit more in depth about child rights in particular. And the first question we have for you are, in times of conflict, what are the most common violations of child's rights? And then in times of disaster, what are the most common violations?
Well, in any kind of conflict or disaster situation, children may be especially vulnerable. In a conflict situation, children may be recruited either to serve on the front lines or provide support for fighters or to do domestic work or to provide sex or marriage to the fighters. Children are also vulnerable when people are fleeing from being separated from their families, for being targeted for sexual violence, or simply for being killed. One of the areas that we have focused on a great deal recently at Human Rights Watch is what happens with children's education in conflict, particularly in places where people aren't necessarily fleeing and conflict occurs over many years. And over that time, children persist in trying to get an education, and teachers often try to continue teaching. And in some conflicts, in fact, around the world, um, education has become part of the battlefield where parties may physically target school buildings. They may want to control what happens in the school. They may target the teachers in order to control them, to affect what they teach. And they may target schools as convenient places to recruit children for fighters, for logistical support, or for sex.
Thank you. For humanitarian actors entering a crisis situation, what are some of the most important factors for them to be aware of when working with children?
Well, the first thing I talk about when I'm talking to my colleagues here at Human Rights Watch is to simply remember that a child is anyone under the age of 18. And, going into a situation where you're faced with a lot of terrible violations, it may be difficult to remember that people who often don't look like children, who aren't acting like children, who have taken on adult roles, may still legally be children and be entitled to special protection that children deserve. So the first thing I suggest is simply remember that a child is anyone under the age of 18 years old. Often, of course, in order to figure that out, people need to ask how old people are, and not simply assume that they're an adult because they look like an adult or they're acting like an adult. Humanitarian workers are likely going to encounter in the course of their work serious protection problems for children, children who are separated from their parents, children who are being physically or sexually abused, children who are being targeted for recruitment, children who are displaced and are unable to get an education. Now, when it comes to actually interviewing children about some of those sensitive problems, people need special training, and it's not something that we, encourage anyone without that training to plunge into. Um, there are concerns about re-traumatizing children, about keeping data confidential. But when people inevitably encounter information about protection problems, there's also an obligation to do something about that. So, um, likely someone who is working on water and sanitation learns about a protection problem is probably not going to do an in-depth interview with a child, but has an obligation to report that to someone who can help. So it's about you being aware of protection issues and trying to pass that information along to someone who can help, who can respond.
What extra protections are afforded to children under human rights law, and which protections are particularly relevant during a humanitarian crisis?
Well, all children have the right to special protection because they are children. We know that children are often especially vulnerable to violations. Sometimes they're actually targeted, and they often need more help in order to protect themselves. In addition, as we spoke about, children can be targeted, for example, for recruitment for sexual violence, but children may also not be able to get an education, or maybe in a refugee camp situation, and are not having access to education either because it's not there at all, or because they have particular problems in getting access to the school. Girls, of course, may face a number of particular problems, whether it's being targeted for violence, having access to education, taking on enormous amounts of domestic work in order to care for their family members. Children are always deserving of protection by virtue of being children, that decisions about children have to be made in the best interest of the child. But in a crisis, we worry about children's physical security, about their access to healthcare, and about access to education. Children may be especially targeted not only to fight, but also for sexual violence. Girls may be particularly targeted. In other contexts, boys may be targeted.
Thank you very much, Zama, for joining us and for answering the questions for our audience.
Thanks for having me.